A millionaire's wife poured wine on a black CEO. She had no idea she'd just pour away her family's future. The Crestmore ballroom glittered like a vault. Chandeliers spilled light over silk gowns and tuxedo lapels. Champagne goblets chimed, and phones lifted like a field of small, watchful suns. At the center of it all sat the Holstons. Charles, the man whose name still opened doors. Lydia, his wife, flawless and practiced in public contempt. Across the room, Adrian Cross stood by a cluster of investors, a quiet presence in a room that mistook volume for authority. He was not a server. He was the CEO whose recommendation would determine whether Holston Dynamics received a $1.9 billion lifeline. Conversations swirled around the pending deal. Numbers, reputations, the faint rust of desperation behind polite smiles. Ava Serrano, CEO of Crestmore Capital, circulated with a practiced smile, evaluating the room the way a jeweler evaluates a stone. Elias Byrne, Holston COO, hovered with a salesman's panic, trying to keep the evening scripted and the future intact. Lydia moved with purpose. She threaded through guests like a command. When she reached Adrian, she assumed the scene as she always had, that some people existed to be seen through, not looked at. She raised her wine glass. She emptied it down his chest, deliberate, theatrical. The golden liquid carved a dark line on his suit. The room reacted in rhythms, gasps, nervous laughter, a few appreciative scoffs. Phones swung up. Someone near the orchestra laughed a thin, nervous laugh. Lydia's smile widened. She had performed humiliation before, and it had usually worked. But the man she soaked simply checked his watch. He did not flail, he did not shout, he did not wipe. He straightened very slowly, as if rearranging a thought. He reached for his phone with one hand and made a short call. The crowd, still leaning on the spectacle, recorded. They thought they had seen everything. What they hadn't seen was what the recording would do later. What they didn't know was who he truly was. What they could not know was how quickly an 8-minute conversation could rearrange alliances. If this holds your attention, subscribe and follow for more stories like this. Adrian's voice was soft on the phone, but brisk in its intention. Initiate a full-scope review. Bring compliance. Pull employee files. Cross-check bonus schedules with safety reports. He named documents and dates with surgical calm. He did not explain. He did not gloat. He simply pressed a set of buttons that once triggered could not easily be turned off. Back at the Holston table, Lydia laughed into her napkin. Charles forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Elias attempted small jokes, but his palms were already damp, and he could taste the possibility of loss. Privilege had always been a form of currency for them. The world, they believed, could be summoned to rearrange itself at their whim. Tonight, that currency slipped.
The first sign of change came as a hush, the kind that falls when a program director pulls a stage light and the audience realizes the show has stopped. Ava Serrano, mid-introduction, paused. She lifted a hand not as a sign of theatrics, but of interruption. On a whisper from her ear, Crestmore's security moved. A compliance officer stepped onto the ballroom carpet with a tablet in hand. Someone dimmed the music. Adrian was ushered to the stage. The crowd, which had gathered for glamour, now watched procedure. Cameras that had once sought gossip now aimed at procedure. Ava spoke into the microphone with a voice that had practiced the sound of decision. She introduced Adrian less as a guest than as an agent of something the Holstons had not anticipated: accountability. The auditors arrived like a change in weather, sudden, inevitable. Forensic accountants and compliance officers sat at folding tables that never belonged in a ballroom and flipped open laptops that immediately projected across a giant screen. At first, the slides were clinical: dates, email trails, annexes. Then the lines tightened. Discriminatory hiring records, suppressed complaints, secret bonus ledgers, safety reports altered to meet production forecasts, internal memos that narrowed down words like expedite and suppress until their meaning suffocated any reasonable defense. The projections were brief and brutal, patterns, not isolated mistakes. Lydia's private performance had become a public demonstration. The room watched in stages: the polite denial, the dawning confusion, the comma of panic. She who had intended to humiliate had handed evidence to the very person empowered to demand transparency. Her smugness curdled into a different sound: disbelief. "Those are mistakes," Charles pleaded when a board member pushed forward, laptop open, the cursor blinking metric after metric. His voice was the voice of a man counting on history to save him. "Those are exceptions. We can explain." Adrian did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. His statement was compact and irrevocable. Crestmore would terminate its partnership pending full regulatory review. Compliance would be involved. The phrase landed like ballast dropped from an elevator shaft. The boardroom geometry changed overnight, alliances reconfigured in the white light of audit trails. Elias moved between tables, a frantic emissary. He tried to broker time. He promised transparency now, remediation later, restructuring to follow. Every promise came off as too little and too late. The documents on the screen did not need tempering words. They needed repair and perhaps replacement. Reporters leaned forward, their lenses swallowing fragments of the Holston name and turning them into questions. Why had complaints been suppressed? Who authorized those bonuses? How deep did the culture go? Lydia's collapse arrived like an anticlimax. She slid down from the pedestal of certainty into the cool floor of exposure.
Her hands flew to her mouth. She apologized, not to Adrian as a person, but to the room as witness, an admission that until then she had been acting under a social script that permitted assumptions. There was a brief, sober beat in which the racialized misperception was named outright. She had assumed he was staff. The wording was simple and factual, a small, necessary recognition of how class and race can collide in expectations. It did not excuse the act. It merely explained why so many in the room had not intervened more forcefully. Everyone had seen what they expected to see. The termination was signed in minutes. Ava's statement was crisp. Crestmore withdrew the proposed lifeline. The $1.9 billion that had been whispered about in private antechambers evaporated into public record. Regulators were to be notified. The term full-scope audit became the drumbeat of the evening. Reporters swarmed. Social feeds bloomed. The Holston name, previously a symbol that smoothed over inconvenient facts, now trended as a family facing exposure. The dynasty's legacy, carefully curated in private boxes and philanthropic plaques, began to fray at the edges. It is rare for a single act of entitlement to alone upturn a company. What Lydia did, however, cracked a window, and through that crack came light that revealed years of neglect and mismanagement. The spectacle had turned into a mechanism of accountability. Adrian's exit was quiet. He walked away from the stage and from the wreckage with no triumph in his step. There was only the restraint of a man who had been underestimated and refused to let that be the final sentence of the night. He had been the target of a petty humiliation. He left as the arbiter of a decision that had been waiting for someone to use the evidence. In the aftermath, the Holston board convened in urgent sessions. Lawyers drafted statements. The family's social pages and the company's press release calendars were both rewritten at once. Lydia's apology circulated as a media artifact. Charles's attempted damage control read like a man trying to buy back time with words. The deeper change, however, was less theatrical. An entire set of governance practices, long tolerated, poorly scrutinized, were now subject to outside examination. The culture that enabled a wife to assume a stranger's role without consequence was no longer private. A week later, Adrian accepted an invitation to speak to a different room at a different table. He did not gloat. He did not boast. He outlined the mechanics of compliance and why boards had to be vigilant. He spoke about evidence, not revenge. His influence, it turned out, was not confined to one dinner. It extended to how capital decided where to sit and who to trust with it. The last image of that night is not Lydia's collapse or the screens of auditors.
It is smaller and colder, a single table where a family once felt invulnerable, its silverware untouched, its centerpiece intact, while the world outside rewrote the ledger. Money had been lost, pride had been exposed, reputation had been mortally wounded. But the greater loss was the unguarded assumption that some people are merely scenery. That belief, the story suggested, costs more than a partnership. It costs stewardship, credibility, legacy. What would you have done if you saw that happen? Share your thoughts below, and if you want more deep dives into stories where power and perception collide, subscribe and share this video.